Hey everyone, just quickly before we jump into the episode, we just want to say, could you please double check you've hit that subscribe button, because it is the best way of supporting the show.
And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit that bell icon as well, so YouTube will notify you when we have our new episodes out every week.
Otherwise, let's jump in.
Hello everyone, welcome back to NeuroNotes. I'm Kenzo, this is Sam. We're the neurological physiotherapists behind PhysiKits, and our goal with this podcast is to make complicated information about neurological rehab and conditions accessible to everyone who's driven to learn more. Now, we have a juicy one here for you today, like all of our beginning episodes, and we're answering the question, are all neurological injuries or brain injuries the same? And to intro this, I think a good place to just quickly start is that essentially any damage to the brain, which is part of the central nervous system, is counted as a brain injury, but it's a big umbrella term, and there are a lot of different categories that can go within that. One big distinction that we want to separate between today's episode and the one we have coming is acute brain injuries, which means something that happens quickly in the short term and has a big onset, compared to slow, what we call insidious, gradual damage that happens over time. And so for today's episode, we're focusing on those acute brain injuries. So that's things like stroke, traumatic brain injuries, things from infection, and so forth that we'll talk through more in a second, compared to neurodegenerative conditions, so things like Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, those kinds of disease processes that happen gradually. We're talking about all of those in the next episode. So we haven't forgotten them, don't worry.
Now, we thought this was a great starting place for the episode, because people usually like to know, what can they get out of listening to today's episode, Sam and Kenzo? So we want to talk about this today because we want to try and give you the knowledge to be able to know what type of information out there is applicable to you. Because typically, what kind of injury or what kind of condition you have is not really explained in context compared to other things. And so, as people know, we're neurological physios. Neurological could mean just about anything. So we want to really try and get everyone listening today to be able to leave knowing what kind of condition that they fall into, because they are really different and they need different approaches, they have different progression, and there's information out there that can be quite general, but we want you to be able to identify where you sit in the realm of conditions.
Exactly. If you remember from last episode, we talked about specificity when it comes to rehab, making sure your approach to battling certain symptoms or problems that you have are coming back to the root cause of that problem. And so we want to start uncovering some of that so you have the basic understanding of where to take your rehab. So
now, today is very content dense.
it is.
So this is it's going to be a fantastic episode, but we put a lot of work into this one, and we've made a really particular structure to try and teach it as best as we can. So today, you'll notice we have little cheat sheets in front of us that have specifically outlined the structure that we would like to follow, because talking about these things, just riffing off the top of our heads, there's a good chance we'd miss something, and we really want to make sure that we get across all these main points so that it all ties in together.
Exactly.
Because if, let's say, we miss one thing, it'll make other things not make sense. So for our own sakes, but for everyone else listening at home, we really want to try and nail going through this kind of outline that we have set. So we're going to be referring back to it to try and make this as consistent and easy to follow as possible.
Could have said that better myself. Perfect. So getting started then, and zooming into brain injuries, specifically those acute type of brain injury onsets, I think a good way to start is talking about the mechanism of injury. So what are the different kinds of ways that the brain can get injured in an acute way? Again, it's an umbrella term, but I think a big partition that comes out of that are strokes. So everyone's heard of strokes before, probably the most widely talked about type of brain injury, at least acute brain injuries. And there are two major ways that they can happen. A stroke, essentially, by definition, is something that's affected the brain that's due to the blood system, the circulatory system. And the two brain branches are the ischemic types of strokes and the hemorrhagic type of strokes. To talk through ischemic ones first, it basically means that blood flow to the brain has been cut off. Your brain's full of, obviously there's all the neurons, but feeding those neurons, they're very hungry cells, nerves. So they're constantly getting fed with oxygen, nutrients, and everything all through the blood. So there's a big network of blood vessels in there.
Most hungry part of the whole human body. I think I don't know exactly. It's like 33% of all our energy consumption is done by the brain.
All our calories. Yeah.
It's amazing. Like it takes a lot of energy to think.
Yeah. It's by far the most complicated organ in our body. And like, despite how much we're going to talk about the things we have learned about the brain, there's still a lot that is unknown. So there's a lot happening in there. And yeah. So to feed all of that processing power that's happening, the blood needs to be getting all those nutrients in constantly as a constant stream. So there's a big network of blood vessels through the brain. And if any of them get clogged, so usually by like an embolus of like a blood clot from the body that flows up to the brain, lodges into one of those arteries. I mean, they do get progressively smaller. So something that's coming from like a big blood vessel in the body gets lodged up into the smaller and smaller ones in the brain, can cut off that blood flow. And then within a matter of minutes, if that oxygen and nutrients aren't getting to and from the brain, then cells and neurons start to die off, and that's when you get brain damage. And that is a ischemic stroke. By contrast, there are hemorrhagic ones. And so that means if there's like an aneurysm, so like a little bubble that forms outside of the vessel wall in the brain, if that bursts, then you get a big bleed in the brain, floods the brain. Just like if you're drowning, you can't survive without getting that oxygen through. Brain can't properly like get its nutrients in and out of the brain, in and out of itself. And so things start to die off, and that happens with a hemorrhagic bleed. And so those are two kinds of strokes that happen.
Then I'll talk about some other acute causes. Before we jump into these next ones though, what I'm realizing is we should probably try and explain what acute means to people listening at home today. So I guess probably a good way of explaining it is acute is something that happens in the moment and the damage is caused in that particular moment. So it's almost like you can imagine something happens and then the damage happens straight away.
Like a sudden
onset. Yeah. And so then the progressive is something that happens over time. So it is not that same big in the moment change and damage. So these ones we're talking about today are all this acute kind. So, which brings me into the next causes of brain damage. We're looking at a few different ones that are a little bit, I guess, less common or less known by people.
And miscellaneous.
Yeah, so we're looking at things like infections towards any of the brain structures. So we're looking at encephalitis and meningitis to lots of different parts of the brain. So they can different structures can get affected by different ways. We've got other things like just different substances or chemicals that have impacts on the brain themselves. It's like toxins, poisons can have, cause the exact same effect. Suffocation, so a lack of oxygen is another one that is, again, it's a little bit, it's harder to get suffocated and have that as being a direct cause as an injury on the brain.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely one to mention here as well.
Differentiating suffocation from ischemic strokes, both essentially are happening from the brain tissue not getting oxygen, but one is internal where the blood vessel itself is cut off, so the oxygen's in the blood, just not getting to the brain. Whereas if your whole body as a self is being suffocated, then your blood's not getting oxygenated, that's not getting to the brain that way.
Yeah. And the last one is a tumor or different types of growths. So essentially anything that could grow in the brain and take up space. So obviously, let's say there's a brain tumor, it can slowly start to grow, it'll start to take up space of the brain tissue itself, and this will cause damage at the time.
Yeah. And then even sometimes the surgical removal as well. You have to sort of, surgeons have to take a big area around the tumor just to make sure they get all of it, none's left behind. And so even the treatment itself can affect the brain, unfortunately. But
we also we won't touch too much on it, but something like, a traumatic brain injury.
Yes.
Like I think these are ones people probably know a little bit more of. It's like, it's an accident. So let's say someone is in a car accident, they hit the head off a fall.
Yep.
Just a blunt force trauma injury.
Yeah, like got assaulted, something like that.
It will also cause, like we're talking about today, that in the moment brain damage then and there at the time. Yeah.
So these all fall under the banner of, these all fall under the banner of acquired brain injuries. And so they're things that you've acquired brain damage in that short-term moment.
Yeah.
And so those are the mechanisms, but of course, that doesn't explain like how different brain injuries can manifest in different ways. Because of course, every brain injury is different from one person to the next. And so we want to explain how that all works to you. But I think the best way to get there is to first talk about the different kinds of areas that are in the brain, what they're responsible for, broadly speaking, and then that'll help to inform you later on. When we come back to it, we can loop around and explain how damage to these different areas cause their difference in symptoms. And so we've got Pinky the Brain over here, who is our little mascot, and we're going to help to use him to describe things today.
Our first intro for Pinky to the show.
Yeah, you've seen him in the background. Now he's going to be a regular member of the show for a little while. And so, broadly speaking here, one thing I want to point out first is that the brain has two hemispheres. So there's it's going to be mirror image, but for us that's the left side and that's the right hemisphere. And before we dive into the different regions, I do want to mention that there's this thing called crossing over that happens in the brain, which is where one hemisphere of the brain, so say the right side, as information travels to and from the body, it actually crosses over and goes to the other side. So that's where you end up with the right side of the brain is controlling and responsible for the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere of the brain is controlling and is responsible for the right side of the body. And so just bear that in mind as we talk through things. We're going to just focus on one side, but it's a mirror image across the brain.
Now, the brain, while we're about to break it down into different areas, we make it sound like there's, in your brain, there might be represented by different colors. Like blue is frontal, green parietal, pink occipital. But this is, in the end, brains are all just pink mush. There can be little anatomical ways of breaking them up, called, with sulcus and gyrus. I think gyri, yeah. So there is ways of breaking them up when you look at it, but to the untrained eye, brains are just a mess of pink blob. So while we have given these things names and areas or lobes, they technically, when you're looking at a brain, you will have no way of looking at it, being able to say, oh yeah, this is where this part ends and this is where that part starts, unless you have very specific experience and know a lot of neuroanatomy and you've looked at a lot of brains. Now, the brain is exceptionally complex. We're going to do our best to make it understandable today. So for those who have a lot of neurological knowledge, which we've got a couple of people listening just because this is their field they work in, some things might not be completely technically accurate today in terms of a neuroanatomy level. It's because we want to make this understandable to everybody.
Yeah. So we are simplifying a lot here, but a lot of this information we're going to be talking about does come from things like functional fMRI scans or functional magnetic resonance imaging. So they can see what activity is happening in the brain when different inputs and outputs are being given to someone. And so while we're going to talk like everything is clear cut, that's not how it really works in practice. It's just on average, these certain areas are sort of more associated with different kinds of activity. So just bear that in mind as we go.
Yes.
Yeah.
So many of these areas cross over information all the time.
All talking.
And all talking at once is a good way to think about it. This is just a way of categorizing it to make understanding each area and the impacts that it causes down, further down the track, make a little bit more sense.
Yep. So with that in mind, let's get into sort of the 5 main areas that are associated with different activities and patterns across the brain. We're going to generally be talking about the outside, so the way that's compartmentalized on the outside of the brain, which is the cortex. And there are sort of 5 distinct regions that are associated with different patterns. I think the first one to start with is the frontal lobe. So that's this bit up the front here. If you imagine that's the front, sitting in my head like this. That's the frontal lobe here. So to our listeners at home who are listening on like audible podcast versions, so on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, we have a model here that we're going to be demonstrating on. So I highly recommend if you get home later on to watch the video on YouTube, because we're going to be demonstrating, but we'll try to talk it through verbally as well. So the frontal lobe is the section of your brain right at the front here, and it's essentially responsible for your intention, your planning. It's where a lot of your personality sort of sits as well, your sense of self and who you think you are. And so if I decide to, say, punch Sam, for example, if he's annoyed me on the day or for whatever reason, then that intention to initiate a motor movement comes from the frontal lobe. Also, speech production, so my intention to say all these words, that's all being first generated in an area called the Broca's area on the frontal lobe as well. Interesting note on the speech production, Broca's area, for most people, sits on the left side of the frontal lobe. not on the right side. And it's generally associated with handedness. So people who are right-hand dominant, which is the majority of the population, I forgot the exact number, but tend to be having the Broca's area on the left side of their frontal lobe, and so it crosses over as well into the right side of the body.
Yeah, yeah, I like that punching analogy.
Yes.
We'll run that through the whole time. Because essentially a good way to think about it is Kenzo's initiated his movement to do it.
Yep.
It's also come from the aggressive side of Kenzo that doesn't really exist, but will exist today.
Good example anyway.
I've annoyed him enough. So that little bit of aggro in his personality that's fueled him on was also, located within the frontal lobe. And him yelling at me, you've done it today, Sam.
Yeah.
You've pushed my buttons just too many times. Also, managed to come from the frontal lobe too.
All frontal lobe. Yeah.
So that brings us into the temporal lobe next. So your temples, typically people know where they're located. Around the ears, let's say. Coming from here is where we kind of get the meaning from sound. So we get a bit more sound processing. We get some memory and we get some emotion. So it plays a crucial role in a few different things, but obviously you can kind of tell that getting sound and understanding what someone is saying to be able to then process that and use that information typically comes from around the temporal lobe. Now, again, if we are going to use the punching example again, Kenzo's yelled at me. I can see the aggression in his face, but I can hear the change in his tone. I know that's not my friendly Kenzo that sits next to me all the time. That's Kenzo who's meaning harm to me. Essentially, I've been able to process that coming through my temporal lobe.
Yep. Quickly, we'll mention too that sort of almost primal instinct section of your brain that's responsible for processing fear, having that initial threat detection. That's all in a deeper section of the brain called the limbic system. So it houses like the amygdala, which is responsible for that fear response, and hippocampus, which is involved in things like memory and emotion. They're deep in the brain, but they are associated with that temporal lobe area. They're sort of in that region, but deeper in. And so that's why they're associated there. Yeah.
Now, same as the frontal lobe had the Broca's area, the temporal has what is called the Wernicke's area. So same thing, typically just located on the left side. And this is essentially where we're getting most of that processing going on for speech.
It's like understanding what someone's saying.
Yeah.
So it's good to have in mind that speech production and comprehension worked on by different parts of the brain. Yeah.
But again, communicating with each other. This is whereas we wish we could say it was easy as one does one, but there's so much information that gets relayed from even different parts of the brain that makes it all work as one fluid thing.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
Yeah,
the brain.
Yeah.
Speaking of all it being interconnected, next up we have the parietal lobes. That sort of sits on top. So you can see on camera here, while the temporal is here, just above it in this area here, that's the parietal. So it sits on top of the brain. And it's responsible for your lived sensory experience of the world. So we call the somatosensory cortex. So that means your senses of the world. So your sense of touch, your hearing gets sent from the temporal to the parietal. Vision, which we'll get to in a little bit, eventually gets sent to the parietal lobe as well. And it sort of pulls it all together and gives you your sensory experience. So we're constantly taking in all this different sensory information, and your brain needs to put that into context. That's all happening up in the sensory cortex there.
Another big part here is proprioception. So again, you can probably, do you want to explain? You have a great analogy for proprioception.
So proprioception
is first.
I like to call it our secret sixth sense. We have actually many, many more than the classic 5 senses or whatever it is that we say we have. I think it's in the tens to hundreds, depending on how you want to differentiate it. But proprioception is a big one, and it's called our sense of position in space. So if I close my eyes and I try and touch my nose, I can do that without any visual input and without any really tactile input from my nose or from my finger. My brain just knows where my arm is in space and where my nose is in space and how to bring them together. And the way that works is our joints, our tendons inside our body all have like little receptors that sense how stretched they are, what position they're in, puts it all together, all happening up here. And so it knows like the angles of each limb, every little bit of your body in space, which is really quite amazing.
So when you're throwing this big right hook at me,
Yeah.
essentially I could get you to hold your fist here,
Yep.
close your eyes, and then you can probably still know relatively if you're going to land it smack bang on my jaw over here.
Yeah, I can roughly envision where Sam was, and I know my hand's up here. Like if Sam moves my hand in a different direction, like I can feel without looking that went to the right. And so that's all happening behind the scenes through the processing in the parietal lobe.
So that brings us onto the occipital lobe next.
So that's at the back of your head here, right at the back of Mr. Pinky.
This is for our vision mainly. Because vision is such an important sense, like the brain representation of how big this area is massive, like compared to like some of the other areas. So, and as you can imagine, it's really important. It's our way of understanding our environment. Of course, the other senses are very important, but vision arguably is how we maintain most of our lives.
Gets a whole lobe to itself.
Yes,
especially
a whole lobe.
Humans, where we rely quite a lot on vision. Yeah.
Now, it tells us lots of different things, like because again, it gets the meaning of these things as well. Things like shape, color, like how far away things are, and like being able to tie those things in all together. So, and again, typically all comes through the big, strong optic nerve, so it's relatively quick as well.
And it does seem kind of counterintuitive that our eyes are at the front of our body and the occipital lobe for vision processing is at the back. Just the quirk of anatomy, the way it works. So the nerves do come out this way, go to the eyes, but then the information gets sent up through the brain, which we'll get to in a little bit, to that occipital lobe for processing.
Another bit here before we leave is the amazing thing that we can do of track a moving target. So again, occipital lobe, relatively automatically, we can just naturally just follow something with our eyes. And even though our eyes don't smoothly move over, they typically just jump between things.
Yes.
They keep everything, what should be like a segmented like jump, because our eyes just go dut, 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 dut. They don't actually track smoothly. It automatically just makes it into one beautiful, smooth, movie-like presentation in our brain.
It's amazing.
Which is truly amazing.
Yeah. Like for example, if I look from Sam to if I keep my head still, look from Sam to the camera, what I perceive is that I get a smooth transition over, but actually it's a very abrupt movement. But yeah, our brain's just always smoothing that out.
Yeah.
I know there are those glasses that you can get these funny glasses on the internet as well, where they basically flip your vision to upside down. And at first, obviously, it feels very off-putting, but I've heard if you leave them on for something like half an hour, eventually your brain kind of adjusts and can start to see right way up again.
Might have to do an experiment. We'll get two pairs and we'll do a whole episode with us.
We'll get a bit confused.
Sinking all over the place.
But yeah, all that happening in the occipital lobe.
Yes. So again, coming back to the punch, I can see it coming. I can see how quickly Kenzo is going for my jaw. I'll know where he is and if I can step back out of the way.
Yeah, exactly. Another quick fun fact. So coming back to the crossing over idea, vision's a little bit different. It's very interesting in the way it works. So you might think that it still happens. So you might assume that right side of the brain is responsible for left eye. It's not quite the case. The way it works is down to visual fields. And so if I close my right eye, I still see this big visual field, but if I separate in half to the left and the right halves, that's my left visual field and my right visual field of my left eye. And so same happens with the right eye. And what happens is the right hemisphere of the occipital lobe is responsible for processing the left visual field of both eyes and vice versa. So it's sort of that two halves of both eyes get sent to one side, the other two halves get sent to the other eye. It's quite interesting.
And very hard to remember.
Very hard to remember, yeah. There are little diagrams that we might pop in the description as well if you'd like to get an input.
I just remember learning about it in uni, like all the amount of circles and like crossing over that goes on. Oh my goodness, it is a nightmare to keep up with.
Yeah.
But it gives us the amazing capacity to perceive depth and know how far away something is by, our amazing binocular vision.
Yeah.
Having two eyes that are coming from different angles that cross over, that then allow us to know how far away something is.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
Amazing.
The brain does a lot of funky things all behind the scenes without us thinking about it.
Most people never even think to appreciate.
Yep. Yeah. Not until something happens.
So that brings us on to the cerebellum next.
So if you imagine this is the fifth kind of lobe of the brain. It's not on Mr. Pinky here, he's lacking a cerebellum, but if you imagine my fist is the cerebellum, it just sits underneath the occipital lobe like that. So the frontal lobe's at the front, occipital lobe just sits at the back, and then the cerebellum is underneath it, and it sort of looks like that. It's about that size too. It looks a bit different to the brain, so it has a different, all this sort of curled in sort of, how would you describe it?
Pink goop.
Pink goop brain shape, yeah, with all the waves and little crinkles. That's all the main cerebrum. The cerebellum sort of has more lines in its appearance. It's just, which is quite interesting, but it's very distinct if you see a picture of the brain. Yeah.
So here comes movement accuracy and error correction. So smooth movement is something truly amazing, and we don't have to think about it. But sometimes processing things can take a long time. So we need some things to happen quite quickly. So error, where the cerebellum comes into play an important role in correcting these things as we go. So for example, we'll use the punch example again. So Kenzo's coming towards me. I'm trying to wiggle out of the way.
So I've got to adjust course
Kenzo
to make sure I'm trying to
can
get
adjust
back there.
course, like for other systems to work would be too slow. So it kind of gives an immediate change to try and keep things going, to be able to achieve the intended purpose of whatever the action was.
Exactly, like if this signal for me, if my frontal lobes generated this signal, like I got to punch Sam, it's very important. And halfway through, if he dodges, I'm not aware of this change in course. My brain I'm not deciding like, I've seen Sam move to the right and I need to follow it, like in Sherlock Holmes when he goes into that like bullet time mode. It's not like that. It's all very automatic. And so that's the cerebellum in action. Yeah. It's, another example I like to give is if you walking down the street and you're not thinking like, I'm putting one step in front of the other. It's all just an automated movement. You're doing that. You're thinking I'm going to get to that shop down the street, got to get my morning coffee, and then your toe catches and you start to fall. You catch yourself, and then after you've caught yourself, you're like, oh, I almost fell. But all that error correction to get you back to being stable happened sort of without your awareness. That's magic of the cerebellum.
And doing it accurately as well.
Exactly. Yeah. It's quite amazing.
Yeah.
We say that a lot. A lot of the brain is really amazing. And so those are the 5 major lobes of the brain. There are a lot of deeper structures as well. So sometimes it gets called like the midbrain, or there's all these different regions that we won't touch on too much here. But we did talk about the limbic system, which is the one for including the hippocampus and the amygdala, which are sort of underneath the parietal lobe in there. Another big important piece is something called the thalamus. So it is basically like the control or relay center. Relay center is better one, like a switchboard for the brain. And so all the sensory signals that are coming from your body need to go up through that thalamus first, and then it decides this signal needs to go to this lobe, this region of the brain, often to multiple at once, and it's relaying all the information between different parts of the brain. So it's like the relay center. Yeah.
And it's working all the time.
Yes.
Like it's not like it kind of gets to pick and choose. There is like sensory information, even just sitting still doing nothing. It's just flooding information to different parts of the brain and like sending it to where it needs to go.
Yeah, and like gating it from places it doesn't need to go.
Yeah.
Like if it allowed everything and constantly, we'd be sort of overwhelmed. There'd be way too much sensory experience going on. So it needs to decide this goes here, this goes there, and at the appropriate time.
So next is then the basal ganglia. Now, this essentially is helping to kind of get movement initiated and stop movement. So it's kind of like gating for like on and off, on and off. So it does this through some neurotransmitters. I think we're going to dive into the basal ganglia by itself in a whole episode because it's important to very particular conditions. So we won't dive into it too much today.
Yep.
But again, just functions to try and get movement started, stop it when we don't need it, and keep it all smooth along the way.
So for example, like if the frontal lobe decides to launch a punch, the basal ganglia then decides whether that actually gets initiated or not. Yeah.
And then also if Kenzo tries to stop halfway, there's the initiation of the on-off of the movement.
Yeah. And then down the very bottom of the brain, again, not here, connecting to the spinal cord is the brain stem. And it's really important for just autonomic functions. It's like the most To use a bit of a buzzword, it's like the most primal part of the brain. And so it's doing everything that's completely outside your control. So like your breathing without being aware of it, your heart rate, and all those sort of like basic life functions are all happening from the brainstem or being controlled by the brainstem.
You can probably imagine any injury here has pretty catastrophic impacts on the body.
Yeah.
And so if you lose the capacity to automatically control your heart rate, your oxygen levels, and like just all these things that naturally happen to keep us literally alive, the results can be pretty dire.
Yeah. So as optimistic as we're going to be when we talk about rehabbing some of these other regions, unfortunately the brainstem is one of those ones where if you have a major injury there, it is resuscitation can be quite unlikely.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty rough one.
And again, it's deep in the brain.
Yeah.
It's typically very well protected because it is so damn vital.
Very, very vital. Yeah. And then of course, we won't dive into it too much, but the brainstem is connected to the spinal cord, which is still part of the central nervous system. So it's the brain and the spinal cord. It's what relays, it's like the superhighway that connects all that brain information to and from the body through your other nerves that branch out of the spinal cord. And so stay tuned for another video we have coming up. It's going to be separate to a podcast. We're going to be explaining the difference between the central and the peripheral nervous system. And we're going to explain that in a structured, detailed way. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But when it comes to spinal cord injuries, they don't count as a brain injury. It's a sort of its own separate beast. But while the brain has a really good ability to work around damage and take responsibility for a region, other regions can take over responsibility for a region that's damaged. The spinal cord is just the path. And so if that's completely severed in a complete way, so in a complete spinal cord injury, those signals just can't get to and from the body. And it doesn't really, at this stage, at least in our medical knowledge, doesn't have a way to repair itself. And so they have a different way of managing those. So we'll talk about them in a separate video as well.
One little thing though is sometimes there's inflammation that can come from those types of injuries that can subside over time.
Yes.
There can be some regain of some of those lost senses, movements, and things like that.
Yeah.
But again, that's probably breaking it into too specific details.
Yeah.
So again, it's just like a good way to think about it is it's almost like a complete
like a traumatic
a traumatic break at the level would mean that everything below that level is essentially lost its function.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was probably over confusing a little bit by saying, because like sometimes you get a blow, you get inflammation around the area that can then also cause the knocking out of those things, but they can regain over time.
100%. I think another fun fact that might help to explain it is the pathways from brain to spinal cord through spinal cord don't use as many nerves as you might think. It's not like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on and forth. Depending on sensory or motor, it's usually just at a very simple level, 2 or 3 neurons or nerve cells that connect to each other. So all the way from up here, down and through to where it connects to the rest of the body is just 1 or 2 nerves. And so that pathway down the spinal cord is actually just the length of one single nerve cell all the way in parallel. So they can be really, really long. If they get completely cut in the middle of their cell bodies, so what we call the axon, that long sort of bit that transmits information, it doesn't have a way to repair itself in the spinal cord, unfortunately. Whereas if it just gets a bit inflamed, so the signals are getting blocked through, but the cell itself is not like cut in half, then eventually that can resolve. And so those are the 2 different ones. But yeah, we'll do a deep dive on spinal cord injuries in the future. But back to the brain.
Now, there are a few more things we want to talk about here. The first, spinal injuries was one of them. Another one was seizures, because again, these can be these aren't very well explained, but we think they're important to cover in this little quick anatomy lesson. So essentially, this is almost like, a good way to think of it is almost like an electrical surge of too much information. So typically, it's of information crossing between the 2 hemispheres. And so some people have they've witnessed seizures, they know what they look like. It is a whole heap of uncontrollable extra movements.
Yeah.
So there's too much electrical stimulation going on at once because of like an ultimate firing between both sides of the brain.
Yeah. Of course, the brain hemispheres are constantly talking to each other. There's this structure that connects the two of them. It's like there's a lot of superhighways. Another superhighway between the hemispheres called the corpus callosum. And yeah, it is constantly talking, but sometimes if it's for reasons we don't fully understand yet, if there's just too much of the information, then yeah, you get a seizure going between the two.
Obviously, there's lots of different kinds of seizures, lots of different types of seizures. We won't be going to those today because again, they all have different ways they present, usually different ways that they get caused, and there's some that we just don't yet know the reason of.
Yeah, still full of mysteries, the old brain.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's just to wrap it up quickly, a short circuit and a huge surge of electrical information.
Yeah. And so I guess it brings us to a big topic that I think Sam best explains here, but cerebral palsy, another sort of umbrella term. It gets seen as a separate condition, but does that count as a brain injury, Sam?
It does, but it differs a little bit from some of these acute brain injuries that we've been talking about. Because yes, it is brain damage at the time, in the moment, but it specifically happens at or around birth. So the impact of this is really quite different from the infant brain to the adult brain, because the adult brain has already developed. It's got its own set ways of working. It's matured and essentially formed all of the typically expected pathways. It's then had a change come in, which has then stopped these pathways from working as they happened before. While in cerebral palsy, the brain has not yet gone through this, 18 to 25 years of development into the adult brain and hasn't formed all these pathways. So absolutely correct. It is quite different because yes, it happens at the time, but it changes how the brain develops. So it can have a similar presentation of symptoms to what some other acute brain injuries have, but the biggest change that it has is how the human body actually develops around the damage that has occurred.
Yeah.
So like a really easy example I can think of is, let's say a child has a cut off from oxygen for a short period of time.
In the womb or?
Yeah, in the womb, and has during childbirth, during pregnancy, during delivery, that can cause brain damage to, again, different types of the brain, which we've just covered. But an adult brain will typically have, we can say, this area of the body has been affected. We expect you to lose this level of functioning, and it'll be relatively similar presentation for most people. But in a child's brain, they're born. They then have to go through, the first early years of life. Their life experience is now going to be different if they had not sustained any brain damage. So then that essentially their presentation as they grow is going to change compared to a typically developing baby.
Yep.
So let's say, for example, we have mainly the frontal lobe gets impacted. Let's say starting to walk and stand becomes delayed. Then the body around this delay starts to develop with the delay. So let's say, for example, like our hip structure, because we don't do the walking, because of our body's inability to actually complete the action of standing, starts to have, our hips don't get the same level of formation as what someone who is starting to do the weight bearing does. And let's say we move that example further down the track. So someone isn't able to achieve standing or walking, they're typically more seated in a wheelchair. Their body will start to form into the position of seating for a much longer period of time because they don't have that same stimulus of being upright, tall, and weight bearing through the rest of their body.
Yeah.
So yes, yes, they both have injuries happen in the moment, but the way that they go over the likelihood of someone's life is very different.
Yeah. It almost makes it into what happened as a brain injury at or around birth ends up becoming a structural rest of the body
Yes,
problem.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it becomes much more some holistic phenomenon that needs to be addressed. Yeah. Great explanation there.
Thank you.
That ties in really nicely then. So it sounds like, similarly like with cerebral palsy and other types of brain injury around childbirth, what happens symptomatically depends on the areas that we've just talked about that are affected. And so I think we'll loop back around now that you have a sort of foundational understanding of those 5 lobes and the deeper regions of the brain, what it can look like when those areas get affected. To come back to the frontal lobe to begin with. So people that have had an assault to the frontal lobe, or like maybe if my punch landed and hit Sam right square in the front of the head, hopefully not, hopefully that never happens, or someone's had a stroke that affects the front there, that can affect their sort of intention, their personality a little bit, like the big tumor in the frontal lobe. I've heard stories where someone who might be very, very sweet, very calm, very gentle, become very aggressive suddenly or gradually. And then they'll find that with enough brain scanning, they figure out the big tumor there. And it's because all those nerves that are in the frontal lobe have been affected. Similarly, motor initiation can be really highly affected by frontal lobe things, as well as speech production. And so once again, that Broca's area that's responsible for speech production is generally, but not always, on the left side of the frontal lobe. And I have a fascinating story of a great uncle of mine who had a stroke to almost exactly that Broca's region. And so he could completely comprehend speech, could understand fully what people were saying to him, but just couldn't get the words out, which was extremely frustrating, as you can imagine for him. Couldn't even write down the information because the information would form, but the areas responsible for producing that were affected by the stroke. However, we got a speech therapist involved, and she tried teaching him to sing the words that he was trying to get out, and had a lot more success with that. I forgot which area is responsible for singing, but it must be independent in this case anyway. And so he was able to communicate through singing, and what she was working on was trying to translate that into speech, which was really fascinating to watch. Which is an example of how rehab comes back to being region specific, but we'll get to that a little bit later. For the moment, that's what happens when the frontal lobe can be affected.
Amazing, isn't it? How, like, again, thinking of the ways things connect in wires isn't a super strong example because that's not necessarily how they work. But for this particular case, it can be handy. It's amazing how there's a few different pathways to achieving something, and the action from going from speaking to singing, it was enough to kind of circumvent where the change had occurred to be able to still achieve the outcome.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
It is really amazing.
Yeah. So then we come to a damage to the temporal lobe.
Yeah.
Dysfunction we can start to think will come through here is not being able to attach the meaning to things, and so being able to put it into context. So being able to understand essentially what impact something has on us, and kind of comparing it all to our own lived experience.
Like the emotions behind something.
Like the emotions behind something, like how it makes us feel. It's hard to explain.
Yeah.
It's like how we attach meaning to things.
Yeah, things might just an experience you had that originally might have given you a lot of joy might just not feel, might give more apathy, like you might have more apathy around something, or those kinds of, it is hard to put into words, and it's very different depending on each individual, but that can affect the way that it's processed in that way. Also, two concrete things are also your speech comprehension might be affected if it's affected your temporal lobe, and also your sense of hearing.
So this should just be not being able to understand verbal instructions.
Yeah.
Whereas written instructions might be fine.
Yeah.
But verbal, no processing.
Yeah. Speaking of, if you have a lesion, another word you get thrown around are lesions, and lesions is areas of damage neurologically. And so if there's damage or a lesion to the occipital lobe, that's when you can get impaired visual processing. So if someone, vice versa, that example, couldn't read anymore, could still understand instructions verbally, then that points towards a damage to the occipital lobe. One thing that we often see with strokes and brain injuries is something called neglect. And so that's where their eyes are working totally fine, but if, say, there's a major bit of damage to the right side of the occipital lobe, then remember the left visual field is where that gets processed, and so that processing is no longer happening. And so there's completely not aware of, in a severe example, of what's happening on the left side. You can wave at them, you can move things around. They might even just generally look more to the right. They might sit sort of off to a skewed angle because they've just forgotten about that left side. it's one of those bizarre neurological phenomena that you can see.
Now we'll come back to parietal. I think another one where we're kind of starting to factor in our lived experience in the world to be able to kind of get meaning and context and like understanding of the information. But again, they're hard to put into words because they all kind of function to do this, but in slightly different ways. But the parietal is essentially much more sensation. So essentially it's like, your touch and feeling would be a really easy way of doing it. Like, being able to understand, not necessarily the understanding side of it, but getting the actual sensory information coming up towards the brain.
Yeah. All this, your lived sensory experience.
Yes.
Like, being a bit jumbled.
Yeah. Like knowing which sensations are which.
Yeah. You might get symptoms like numbness because the touch sensations aren't being processed right. We get phantom sensations, like one part of your body might just feel inexplicably hot or cold for some reason, just because the processing of sensory information is all gone a bit haywire.
Yeah. Well, it's like the if like an amputee having like phantom pain.
Yes. Yeah.
Like it's so let's say you have your leg chopped off from just above the knee. It can be a really common sensation to feel like your leg is there, and because your brain essentially still has a representation of sensation, so it can feel like it's in pain, or it has like odd sensations but whereas when you look down, there is no limb there to feel a sensation, but the brain still has its representation
in the mental map.
Yeah.
If anyone listening wants to do a bit of Google search for I think it's called the somatosensory homunculus, but it's basically it is a literal map of like our different body parts across that somatosensory cortex, and it weights different areas of our body more heavily. Yeah. So like our hands have a lot of sensory neurons that our brain does a lot of processing for, like hands and
lips.
Yeah.
So it's like a bigger pucker demonstration of yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Giant feet and giant hands.
Yeah, and like torso is tiny. There's not much processing that comes for the torso. It's very fascinating. So sort of the mirror image of that phantom limb pain is if the brain's affected, body's still completely intact, it'll just won't be processing the signals that are coming in as accurately anymore. And that similarly, if we come to the cerebellum, which again was responsible for error correction, if that error correction process is not happening smoothly anymore, you can get coordination problems. And so clinically, we use the word ataxia a lot, which is an umbrella term of lots of these coordination difficulties. And so, for example, if I'm throwing out a right hook to Sam again, but that's not, my cerebellum's not processing that in real time anymore, my frontal lobe might initiate things correctly, but then now it's in the hands of the cerebellum, I might think I should stop about here, but I end up going further and end up overshooting. Or I think I've reached him, but I've stopped well short. Same as like reaching for a cup of coffee, I end up hitting it and knocking it over, or the movement itself is very jerky. That's all coming from cerebellar damage.
Dysmetria
is the word, I think.
Is the word. But that can be like under and over. So there's hypo and hypermetria. And so essentially, typically it's always undershooting something. Or overshooting something.
And knocking stuff over.
Yeah, exactly. Like, so for example, like imagine you're trying to pour a jug of water, you hold the cup, hypometria is going to undershoot all the time, whereas hypermetria is going to overshoot the pouring of the cup.
And that's a very basic example. You can imagine with more complex movements like walking, can become really much trickier if that area is affected. You might have completely normal strength. Speaking of strength, that would come under the motor initiation of the frontal lobe again. So if you have that flaccidity where everything's gone limp, that's usually if the motor centers are being damaged, or either from the deeper substantia nigra that we talked about earlier. Basal ganglia. Substantia nigra is part of it. But the basal ganglia deeper in, if that's affected, that's the gating for yes or no for movements to happen, or the initial initiation from the frontal lobe, you can end up with that weakness. Whereas if it's a cerebellar injury, you might have completely normal strength, but the coordination of that strength is really breaking down. And so you'll get like very jerky walking patterns. They might look like they can't lift their leg properly, but actually it's just because nothing's firing in the right order.
So one more thing that jogs my memory on that could be handy to talk about is spasticity. Now this is really quite tricky to explain.
I think we'll do a deep dive on that.
We're going another deep dive on that again, But so essentially, spasticity is a passive stretch reflex. So let's say, for example, I move your wrist really quickly. There's a reflex that switches on that essentially stops it from going too far to cause injury. But in something like cerebral palsy, let's say, for example, the stretch reflex can either be absent or it can be overactive. So it happens like too quickly. Now, in terms of what specific area of the brain, in what brain damage area causes this, it's quite diffuse. It's too tricky to say which particular area is causing this particular impairment to happen. But essentially, it's that change where your body is now pushing back against, like it's too much of a reflex.
Yep.
So whereas if I was assessing someone with typical development, they wouldn't have this stretch reflex present. Someone with cerebral palsy and has spasticity is that they've had the changes from the brain along as quite well the pyramidal tracks and different parts. So I think it's the frontal and temporal lobe. So it crosses between quite a few areas.
Yeah.
It essentially exacerbates this stretch reflex.
Yeah.
So again, we won't dive into it too much today because otherwise it could get quite
deep
confusing.
Yeah, but you'll see, like, even in people with, say, like people with a stroke, if you, they might look very limp and weak, but then if someone does you're the doctor, there's that reflex hammer where they swing it and sort of hit that bit just below your knee. That initiates a stretch reflex, which we'll talk about in another video. But in everyday life, for people who have completely intact nervous systems, there's that gating mechanism, like brain sort of inhibiting that from being too big. People who have anywhere along that motor pathway that Sam was talking about, if it's affected in the central nervous system, that inhibition is no longer happening.
Exactly. Perfect. Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what I was trying to sum up. And so again, that kind of ties into, again, this is a bit more along for cerebral palsy specifically for people growing from infants to adults. But even though the impairments or symptoms might look like they're coming from the peripheral end, so like let's say the ankles or the hands,
the muscles themselves,
exactly, or like the muscles themselves, it's actually coming from not being able to switch on and switch off things in the brain itself. So while looks like it might be a really stiff ankle, it's potentially just come from spasticity in the brain, having too much of this stretch reflex that has kept the foot in a pointed position, that has then, over time as the body's grown, led the ankle to be in a fixed position. So this is where sort of like children and adults are very different and need quite different management strategies and need to be explained differently.
Yeah.
Is because for children, they are growing around these neurological symptoms.
Yeah. Even to compare, it's quite interesting to compare and contrast strokes and cerebral palsy, I feel, because same mechanism plays out in different ways. So you can see if someone has that flaccidity and spasticity, where say they might end up in this sort of position where their arm's always bent. If that gets left untouched, it's also going to cause a fixed muscle shortening in that position. And we call that contracture, by the way. Same as it would happen in cerebral palsy, just the difference is the body's not going to go through growth changes as an adult. At least nowhere near to the same degree that obviously a child would through puberty, and so it looks different.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm going to put Pinky down for a second. For now, Hannah's getting a bit tired. But that basically explains like how the different brain areas can be affected and how that would look. By function. And so I think to loop it all back to rehab, our goal as physiotherapists or any rehab practitioner is basically to try and target the underlying cause for a symptom. So, for example, if we see someone's very weak, we would need to, in one particular area, we would want to make sure that our exercise are addressing like why is it weak. Lay person who doesn't understand neuroanatomy, to come back to that walking example, they might see someone walking in a very uncoordinated way, but they might think, I think it looks like they're dragging that leg. It's probably very weak. Let's do a lot of leg strengthening. Whereas we come along, we assess things, we check any imaging scans, and we end up finding out that it's the cerebellum that's really affected. We would then want to target that with a lot of coordination-based exercises to try and get the cerebellum to rewire, rather than just working on strength, which might be totally fine. Yeah, that's one big example.
Yeah, and similar, I guess, if we come back to the cerebral palsy child example, is, let's say, for example, it is spasticity. Like knowing, for example, how to manage spasticity by, knowing, number one, where it comes from, and then being able to kind of put in a plan, knowing that it's not necessarily the muscle we need to change. It's kind of, it is the muscle, that's the area we need to try and get some intervention to improve, but it's not caused from there. It's happening from the stretch reflex. So we can we plan our intervention around trying to factor that in.
Yep.
So for example, just going and doing trying to do some passive stretching or some calf stretches off a block. Yes, that might be stretching out the area, but we're not addressing the underlying issue of the spasticity itself.
Yeah. And you should trying to prevent downstream things as well.
Yeah. And so, like, for example, there's changing how someone walks using orthoses or orthotics to be able to try and re-achieve that walking alignment that we're trying to get, to be able to help the rest of the body take relatively even strides and be able to get the amount of same weight bearing through most of the other structures of the body. Is one way.
Yeah, exactly the same thing happens in stroke rehab too, where someone just isn't, for example, they might have a combination of like neglect, they're not aware of one side. Let's say the parietal lobe, the vision, let's say occipital lobe's fine, vision's intact, whereas the parietal lobe that has that lived sensory experience of the world has been affected on one side. So they have a sensory, but not vision, neglect of one side. They don't have that proprioception, they're not feeling what's going on that one side. I've seen this time and time again, where they'll have a combination of weakness from frontal lobe damage and sensory impairment from the parietal lobe. And I'll get someone to stand. I'm like, how even do you feel like you're standing? You can see they're like way up, off in the camera. They're leaning really heavily on one leg, and they're like, yeah, pretty 50-50. And we have to my job then is to then try and teach them, like, no, actually, you're leaning really heavily on this side. Yes, we have to build strength on that other side, but also we have to try and get your brain to become more aware that it's not 50-50 as you feel it is. And so, for example, strategies we can use are getting some scales out, putting them under each foot, standing up, and actually see visually how much weight is being put through each side. And so those are the kind of strategies we mean when we're trying to target the underlying cause of the symptoms, that the area's been affected by the brain damage.
Yeah. Which is where comprehensive assessment and like knowing typically what brain areas cause what things to happen, so we can kind of start to link up all of this information to come up with the best management plan possible.
Exactly. And then want to mention too that the brain has, again, another topic that deserves a big deep dive, that the brain has such a remarkable ability to sort of rewire and not just circumnavigate, as we've talked a little bit about, that's a big part of it, but also to reform pathways in areas that are affected. And so what may look really dire, for example, after a stroke initially, someone might have absolutely no control or sensation through one side, where it appears that way. And then with a lot of rehab, especially early on, but not always, as we talked about in the previous episode, you can reawaken motor function and sensory function and awareness on that injured side. And it's neurons healing, rebuilding pathways, but also areas of the brain that were not initially responsible for certain regions might take over functions of the areas that are affected. This might need a fact check, but I feel like I've read, for example, in people who are blind, say blind from a big injury, that occipital lobe no longer is processing visual information because it's just none coming in. Let's say the blindness comes from the eyes themselves. Then that, instead of being sort of dead weight, the occipital lobe can then start to process other sensory information as well. So it sort of boosts the sense of like hearing and sense of touch to try and compensate. And so it's using that spare brain space for something that's useful.
Like Daredevil for all those Marvel fans.
Yeah, exactly like Daredevil, without the cool suit. Unless you want. But yeah, it's amazing stuff.
Now, I just got some, and same thing for like cerebral palsy. I'm gonna try not to dive too much into it, but it's like, let's say you have a baby, just the awareness of knowing that these things are really important for a child to do, to then there's alternative ways to get them to do these things that typically like usual, like babies who are like 0 to 2 years old are starting to develop them typically. There are ways of getting a baby to start achieving these things without them doing it in the way that is the most usually set out for them automatically, which then gives someone the opportunity to do it, even if it's in a forced manner, let's say a standing frame or a walking frame. They start to get the same level of structural development, even with the same neurological impairments, which allows them to continue with the same structural development as their peers. So yeah, I won't go into it too much, but it's kind of similar to like the rewiring around. It's like even in light of having the neurological impairments, there's so many things we can do to set things up to keep things developing as they typically would.
And then I imagine if they had that assistance where the body then develops in a typical way, whereas they wouldn't without the assistance, then part of the brain that, say they were completely left untouched, the body would sort of form in a not ideal way because the brain pathways aren't working.
An atypical way.
An atypical way to use the clinical term. Could then lead to sort of brain regions, sort of a negative feedback loop. Where the body's forming atypically and the brain will sort of keep reinforcing those patterns. Whereas if you assist them early to get the body to form typically, then the brain might reawaken and work around those motor patterns and become a bit more.
Exactly. And then it's like use it or lose it.
Yes.
And then knowing what you need to use to be able to have it grow is why I love my job. It's amazing to get to see that whole action and process. Because again, you don't use it, you don't gain it. But you do use it, you gain it. And so it's figuring out how to actually do it to gain it. Is the fun part.
It's amazing. The magic of neuroplasticity.
Yes. Much more of a deeper dive into future episodes to come.
I think we'll make a pure like sort of infotainment educational video all about that topic as itself.
Because it needs demonstrations. It needs like to be able to really unpack that. I think we'll need to use quite a few resources. But
So speaking of, just to replug this, in the coming maybe a few weeks from when this episode comes out, we should have a video that's talking about the differences between the central, so brain, spinal cord, and peripheral nervous system. And so today you've learned about the different parts of the brain. There we'll talk about how different symptoms can manifest, but after teaching you how the brain talks to the body. So the pathways from sensory input from body up to brain for processing, and vice versa, motor initiation from brain voluntarily down to body. So stay tuned for that. I think it'll be really helpful to watch that one after this video.
And if you've loved today's episode, whereas today has been all about acute, next episode is all about the other side of the coin, which is typically neurodegenerative conditions. So things that happen over time.
So if you have multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, all that kind of thing, talk about that in the next one.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
That was great fun. I really enjoyed it. If you enjoyed these clinical deep dives, please let us know, because they're sort of very fun for us to make. And so we'd love some feedback if you found it helpful, found it interesting, if there's anything you think you'd like us to talk about a bit more, in more detail, please give us a comment down below.
Because they are a little bit of a different structure. They take a lot of planning, a lot of work. And so to get that structure right. So we like to think it's a good blend of our usual model. It's something a little bit more scientific.
We like science over here. It's a whole goal to try and make it understandable. But to link it back to just a few key takeaways before we wrap up, there's roughly 5 sort of main regions of the brain, all responsible for different regions. We won't go through them all again. We have the frontal, the temporal, the parietal, the occipital, and the cerebellum. And depending on the region affected, can manifest as different symptoms because they're all responsible for different things.
And to quickly summarize, some deeper bits and bobs.
Including the brainstem. And so if a good goal of rehab is, or for good rehab to be specific, like we talked about, the underlying area that's affected and the reasons for the symptoms that manifest need to be addressed directly. And so that's a very key detail.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed it.
Really hope so.
Leave us any likes, comments that you'd like, and of course, as always, subscribe. It helps us so much.
Hit that bell.
It's the best way you can show your support and love for the show.
And otherwise, we'll see you in the next one.
Bye.